Timothy Poell is the Associate Director at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill Chicago office, and he was also the Senior Designer on the Broadgate Tower in London, which is the winner of the 2009 Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat Best Tall Building Award for Europe. And congratulations on the award.
Thank you.
This is a special building. London is always such a difficult place to build in. There's so many constraints there. Tell us about the building and about the constraints and what you had to deal with.
Okay. You know, as you mentioned, it is a difficult city to build buildings in. The history of the project is a little bit worth going into because the project was initially started around Liverpool Street Station in the mid-1980s when the deregulation of the banking environment happened, which allowed essentially trading to go on around the world. That encouraged U.S. investment bankers and trading companies to find 8-hour time segments around the globe so that they could essentially trade 24 hours a day. When that happened, there was a sort of massive rush in Europe to establish that center. In London and Great Britain, they made that very easy for a lot of people to do by offering incentives for development. And consequently, in and around Liverpool Street Station, a lot of property was developed to support that banking industry. At the same time, Canary Wharf was struggling to get a sort of a foothold in the action, and Frankfurt was too. And I think, you know, knowing what we know now, hindsight being 2020, London, you know, really has emerged as that sort of center in that 8-hour time segment. Canary Wharf, you know, was a little bit behind because they had to develop all the infrastructure in and around Broadgate. It existed. So in the mid-1980s, there were a series of developments that happened in and around Liverpool Street Station. SOM was involved with half of them. I would say about 15 buildings we did. Broadgate Estate is over 4.5 million square feet supporting that segment. You know, over the years, there are a series of buildings that were built that led up to, before 2 on Bishopsgate and the Broadgate Tower. The final building being one of Bruce Graham's, what I think is one of his best buildings, is called Exchange House, or Phase 11, and it is a structure that spans over the railway tracks. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's not a tall building, probably 12 or 13 stories. Skeleton building, but it's got a black, painted black exoskeleton, and the entire thing is sort of this giant arch, and the building is kind of suspended within that arch, which then spans over the railway tracks. Our client, British Land, came to us, and we've been with them. Originally it was Stanhope, then it became British Land that owned all the property. They came to us and said, well, we're ready to take on the next phase of the development. And this was, I would say, late 1980s. And in 1990, we received a planning consent to build what we call a raft over the site for 2 on Bishopsgate and the Broadgate Tower. 2.5 acre site. It is an air right site. In other words, when we received the project, there was no site there. Tracks were below grade, and essentially they received rights to build over the top of that. So in 1990, we began, actually in 1995, we began construction of the raft, which essentially encapsulated the railway lines, sterilizing it. And at the time, there wasn't a market for a building, but they knew they wanted to build something. The site also has as a constraint a view corridor from King Henry's Mound, which limits the height of anything being built to about 13 stories, with the exception of a very kind of small corner of it. So at the time, everybody thought, okay, we're going to build a 13-story building. So it was designed to support that. And if you sort of heard any of the interviews yesterday, Steve Watts, is it Steve Watts? Yes, it's Steve Watts from Davis Langdon gave a presentation on the Shard and really talked a lot about the difficulties of getting planning permission in the City of London. It's incredibly difficult. These things can take years to do. And what ends up happening in that building environment is building owners commission architects to get planning permissions, which can take a year or so to do. It's a tremendous investment. And at that point, there's very little speculative building being built. So during that same period of time, they're marketing the building, trying to find out if there are interests in the market, and will really only build something when they've got a pre-lease arranged. Over the years, since 1990, we've received 4 planning consents for that site, essentially 4 other ground scrapers, which we did. So massive 800,000 square foot ground scrapers, which were designed to support the financial markets, had large dealing floors on them, massive, floor plates. That didn't go. And then in early 2000, 2003, I believe, we were approached by the client and said, look, these big floor plates aren't going to go anywhere. The market won't support them. We need smaller buildings. So we went through a number of studies that looked at putting smaller buildings on the raft, but none of them yielded enough area, because they need to make the performance numbers work. We stumbled on this idea and said, well, look, there's this one corner of the raft that doesn't have a view corridor encumbering it. What if we poke up through that? And that gave rise to this idea of putting a tower. No one had envisioned that when they designed the raft. The other rule was, well, okay, you can put a tower on there, but you can't go back down underneath the raft where the railway lines are. You can't touch anything in there. And that then led rise to, okay, well, if we can't touch it, how do we do it? And we knew we had caissons down there that could support a certain amount of loading. And we came up with this idea where we take all of the structure on the east facade and essentially transfer it over to a bearing line in the middle of the raft, which was directly above the caissons, and then bypassed all of the raft altogether because it wasn't designed to support a 36-story building. At that point in time, the mayor, Ken Livingston, was supporting this idea of towers in London. It was incredibly controversial. At that point in time, there was really only one big tower in London, Tower 42, at 183 meters tall. And then there was, of course, the BT Tower, which is up by Fitzroy Square, but it really wasn't a building. It was more of a communications tower. And Ken was supporting the idea of this cluster, this idea of a cluster of towers in the square mile, which is the financial district in London. And we were really, I would say, like the second one online with that. Worked very closely with the planning department. And in the spring of 2005, we submitted our planning application for what's now known as Broadgate Tower 2 on Bishopsgate, which was essentially a 13-story low-rise building that had about 500,000 gross square feet in it, and then a 36-story high-rise tower that had, again, about 500,000 gross square feet in it. The height was determined by a lot of work with the city planners, and also we just basically maxed out the capacity of the existing foundations. We wanted to go higher. In fact, we were pushed to go higher by the city planners, but we just couldn't make it work. It just wouldn't pencil out.
What was more of the evolution of this project? Because from the looks of the diagrams I've seen, is this started out as one building and ended up being split into 2 structures?
Yeah, it was one massive ground scraper. The first 3 floors were designed as large trading floors of about 80,000 square feet, which would support 1,500 traders on a floor. I mean, it's a massive factory, for trading. And then above that, it began to be sort of broken up and fragmented into more leasable office space with a series of, skylights and area wells and those kinds of things. But, those buildings they couldn't let those buildings out. Most of the big dealing floors ended up going out to Canary Wharf at that time.
There's so much of the engineering, the support system for the building that's expressed on the surface of this. Was that a necessity just because of space constraints that you had to come up with a structural system that would, of the kind that you did?
Yeah, it had a lot to do with a lot of things. Buildings, we believe buildings belong to the context and that they should reflect their context and the time they're built. As I started off, I was saying directly to the south of here was another SOM building, one of Bruce Graham's, I think one of his best buildings, which was the Exchange House, which was the exoskeleton building. The frame was expressed on the outside of the building. Directly north of the site is a bridge over Worship Street and spans over the tracks below, which is this old Victorian age bridge. It's all full of cast iron and riveted together. It has this other kind of expression. And we took those 2 elements and said, okay, well that's our context. How can we be sympathetic to that, but yet sort of be modern about it? And so we took this architectural structural expression as an idea, and then did it out of stainless steel. It's expressed on the outside of the building because of the amount of space that we had to poke up through the view corridor was so small. There are no interior columns, none whatsoever. The floor plates are only 19 meters wide, and it's 75 meters long. The cores are shifted off to one side. views from up there are just unbelievable because there are no columns, and the glass-to-glass dimension is 19 meters. So you're always very, very close to daylight when you're in that building. The traditional, well, closer to the traditional point tower, can express the structure, but the diagonals on here are a result of not having a core that we could utilize for stiffness. Typically it's a concrete core or a steel core that's reinforced. This one, the cores not only were on the outside of the building, but they never even touched the ground. They actually sort of were hung above the ground on top of the raft. So you couldn't transfer any of those lateral loads through the core back down to terra firma. So that's why we had to use this externally braced frame. We chose to express it and then clad it in stainless steel.
And this is very John Hancock-esque.
Yes,
The same concept applies because you're carrying the load on the outside of the building and you've got all of that free space inside.
Absolutely. And the thing that makes that expression, I think, even more exciting is what happens to that eastern face of those diagonals and those columns as they come down. Because at the sixth story, they begin to splay out and reach that point in the raft I talked about earlier. But what's equally important is they actually go both ways. They create what's called an A-frame. So all the loads are coming down, and we don't just have that, because what would happen if you did that? The thing would tend to want to fall this way. So it's just a giant A-frame. And thereby, everything underneath this six-story space is hung. And it creates this wonderful, magnificent Galleria space between the low-rise and the high-rise buildings. I did also want to say that in addition to creating two buildings, we also thought it was very important to enhance the public realm. Some of the early schemes of these massive ground scrapers. There were some people yesterday talking in the conference about, well, sometimes recessions have positive impacts on cities. This would actually be a case of that, because some of the first schemes were ground scrapers which didn't allow any pedestrian movements or really provide any public space at the ground level. And they were essentially sort of created the wall, hugged the wall, created a nice urban edge, but at the same time didn't give a lot back to the city and the people who live and work there. The two-building scheme, the site was over 2 acres, but we actually gave back more than an acre of the site back to the city. We didn't give it back to the city. It's available for public use. Created this massive Galleria space between the low-rise building and the tower, which is informed by the transfer structure. But to the south of there, we opened it up and created a massive public plaza, for people to use. And the Galleria space is covered. It's covered because we wanted to create an environment to create basically a destination for people. It's going to be filled with wine bars and cafes and shops. It's also serves as a major pedestrian connection from Liverpool Street Station to the north. And just to the north there's an area called Shoreditch. And the city has identified that area as sort of the next area of growth and development. So in a lot of ways, this was sort of the next link in the chain of providing pedestrian movements through the site, which the client didn't have to do. We pushed very hard to get done and encourage that development to the north.
I was going to ask you if it's more satisfying as an architect and more fortunate for this project that it was broken up into two pieces as opposed to having one monolithic building, because you've got such interesting spaces in between, and the space that you've created there is unique.
A lot of times it's constraints that create this opportunity for language and for dialogue between the public realm and the private realm. They give you sort of opportunities to do things that normally you wouldn't do, and so the transfer structure is one. You normally wouldn't take the entire face of a building and transfer it out, but the constraints here led to a solution that is unique in character and provided great opportunities for the architect, but also achieved very good results for the client at the end of the day.
One of the things that the jury liked, and one of the reasons why this building won the Best Tall Building Award, was they talked about how the space, the envelope, the structure, and all of the services were combined seamlessly. And you've got kind of the usual array of sustainable features, heat recovery and variable speed drives for pumps and fans and office lighting, variable office lighting, and the kinds of things that you would expect there. Is it that difficult to combine all those things and get them balanced and working properly in something that size?
No, and actually I'm glad you brought that up. There are a number of projects that have won awards recently, and it's for all of the efforts that they put forth to sustainability. A lot of sort of wind turbines and photovoltaics and sort of these ground source heat pumps and wells, and these things are all really wonderful, wonderful things. But you know, buildings can be designed to be sustainable without all the kind of the, you know, sort of the bells and whistles. And it comes back to, I think, some very good, just fundamentally grounded ideas about architecture and about design and sustainability. Things like, for example, taking this site, which was a brownfield site or a site that didn't exist before, and actually creating something positive for the city out of it, creating density where density belonged, and also taking what was basically an urban scar and creating something out of it that's positive. Siting of a building properly can reduce energy loads tremendously. Choosing the right glass can reduce energy loads tremendously, can promote daylighting, it can encourage people to turn off lights. There are all kinds of things that, you know, architects can do before they actually resort to, okay, I'm going to put a wind turbine on it so everybody sees, oh, this is a sustainable building. You know, I didn't talk about it yesterday, but, you know, the project has green roofs on it. Those things were all done. It achieved what's called a BREEAM rating, which is I think it's a European rating system similar to our LEED system, very good. And I think that you could probably equate that to a silver. It wasn't very hard to achieve that rating. You know, you mentioned a few things like heat recovery, variable speed drives, highly efficient mechanical systems. With some very good sort of site planning and construction administration, you can achieve very good buildings without having to sort of resort to some of these other more extreme measures.
Well, I'm thinking as you're saying this that maybe this is a building that is sustainable that perhaps really doesn't announce it quite like other ones do.
It's not in-your-face sustainability. That's absolutely the case. You know, in terms of the materials being used, the amount of waste being generated, everything about the building is what I'll just call intelligent design. It's not in-your-face sustainability. You know, there's this is a relatively new movement, sustainability. However, it's not new in terms of what we practice. We've been doing this for a very long time. It's called responsible practice. And, you know, there used to be a cost, there is a cost to incorporation of all these sort of elements that make buildings greener and more sustainable. And when you work in a developer world, it's usually about what can we afford to do that. Thankfully, you know, the paradigm is shifting. There are tenants now that are demanding office space that is green space. Because a lot of corporations don't own their property, they rent their property, their ability to be sustainable and affect the environment is driven by what they mandate in their leases. Particularly the younger companies, which, you know, the younger people are more aware of the impact of their presence in the environment in the world, and they want to retain their younger employees. Companies are actually listening to them, saying, okay, these things are important to our employees and for employee retention. Therefore, we're going to adopt sort of corporate policies that we're not going to rent space unless it's a building that achieves a certain amount of efficiency and sustainability. That market is very large in Europe. You know, one of the things that I was very much involved with at Broadgate was also the leasing side, supporting our client, going to interviews with prospective tenants, and really talking about the building, because there's a great interest in the market in Europe about what is this building all about. You know, how is it green? How is it sustainable? What is it going to do for me? And those things do cost extra on the developer side, but the developers are now realizing that's actually a market for them to be able to sort of obtain these kinds of tenants.
Are there any other points to be made about this structure? Because I'd like to go on to Trump Tower and ask you a few things about that.
Yeah, we can move on.
Okay. Trump Tower in Chicago, we all wish it was a 2,000-footer, and we were talking to the Trump organization the other day, and it was indeed originally planned that way, and you've been involved in this project really from the beginning. One of the first things, or one of the things that I've heard about over the years that I've asked several people about was the infamous morning of 9/11 meeting, because this was originally aimed at being a world's tallest building, and it's on such a wonderful site in the city of Chicago. And I'm just curious that, you know, the story goes that you had a meeting with the Trump organization that morning to discuss the world's tallest building, and it ended up going a different way. Tell me about that morning.
It was, to describe the morning, let me a little bit of history before that morning occurred. We started work on this project in the spring of 2001, and at that time Donald wanted to build the world's tallest building. At that point in time, 2,000 feet was that maximum. That's that sort of FAA threshold that no one had sort of broken or even sort of dreamed of breaking at that time. And we had developed over the summer a half a dozen schemes of a 2,000-foot tower on that site, which was very challenging because it's a fairly narrow site, and 2,000 feet is a very tall building. But we came up with 5 different schemes, and the morning of 9/11 was the very first morning where the Trump organization was coming to Chicago to view and look at these various schemes. They arrived, I would say, I think it was like 9 o'clock, 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. And we hadn't really, we were all at work already anyway. We hadn't really sort of understood what was going on. Somebody said, "Oh, did you hear something's going on in New York?" But it's one of those things where if you heard it today, you say, "Oh, there's a wreck on the Eisenhower." You just say, "Okay, fine, it's tragic, but we're going to continue." And the Trump clients arrived and they said, "Did you hear what's going on in New York?" And I said, "No, what's going on?" I said, "Well, like a plane has crashed into one of the towers." And at that point, we said, "Well, let's roll in one of the televisions that we have in the office into a conference room." And the entire team just sat there, just absolutely stunned, for like an hour. And I don't know, there was hardly even a word being spoken, but oh my God, oh my God. And I think it was about noon, and the Trump organization said, "Look, we've all worked very hard to get to where we are today. Why don't we go ahead and have our meeting? There's a lot of hard work that's been done. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody knows what the impact of what's been going on is to this project. Let's just go ahead and have it, and then we'll just sort of figure out where we go from here." Not long thereafter, they closed down the loop. They sent everybody home, but we persevered. We stayed on. Santa Fe building, our offices were closed, but we went over to the zoning attorney's office and held up in their conference room with a little black and white television going in the corner while we went and did what we needed to do in light of all that. That day was over. It was really one of the most eerie days I can ever remember leaving the office. It was 5 o'clock, and I was walking to the train, and there was nobody downtown. There wasn't a taxi cab driving. There wasn't anybody on the street. It was just one of the strangest feelings I think I've ever experienced. It's something that I'll never forget. And following that, obviously they were still very interested in doing something, but obviously we didn't know whether people would want to live in a high-rise building again, work in a high-rise building again, anybody would build a high-rise building again. We simply didn't know. The Trump organization came to us and said, "We need your help. You guys are the high-rise building experts of the world. We really need your help to understand what it is that we should be building, because we don't know." Again, you probably talked to Eric. The building was designed with lots of flexibility into it. Initially, it started off as a 3 million square foot office building. As you know, today there isn't 1 square foot of office building in it. We spent the next probably 2 years or longer trying to understand not only what the market would support, but what kind of buildings should we build. Because at this point, Donald didn't have a program. He said, "You tell me, what should I be doing?" We looked at the city carefully, just in terms of, okay, we know we have a site. What should we put there? And how big should it be? And then once we looked at that and worked with the Trump organization, then we started to fit a program into it, a program that could be flexible. And it is what it is today, about 2.5 million square feet, or 2.3 million. Again, it started as a lot of office space and a little bit of condominium. And as we began to work with the city to get the plan development approvals, we watched the market change from what would have been an office market to what is today basically an all-housing market, to 500 residential units and 300 hotel units. And at the same time, we're working with the city, establishing a planning envelope. This is the bulk, this is the size. It's what we knew we wanted to do. We just didn't know what was going to be in it. And we spent the next few years trying to figure that out, develop drawings, begin caissons, doing all that work without really knowing where we were going to end up. So it was an incredibly challenging project in that respect, from beginning to end. And thankfully, it is one of Donald Trump's best buildings that he's ever done. He's come out and he said that. It's one of his most successful buildings. And I think it's a testament to all the hard work that, that organization did and that, SOM provided as well.
That's an incredible story, and I'm wondering how much the form of the building changed. Did you have to really entirely throw out the initial designs? Were there anything at all retained from that? Because I'm thinking, just because of the shape of the site, that kind of triangular flat iron lends itself very nicely to that. Were the original buildings that same way or completely different?
No, the original 2,000-foot towers were significantly different. They were point towers that either tapered from sort of a wide base to a very narrow top, or they wedding caked as they went up. The site's only, I'm going to get my numbers wrong, so I think it's only 180 feet wide at the narrow spot, parallel to the river there, or perpendicular to the river. It's very long in the other direction, the one Blair doesn't like. To get a building 2,000 feet tall to stand up, you got to put some feet out. This thing's got to stand up. The north-south dimension of 180 is fairly narrow. It involved some pretty complicated structural gymnastics and some pretty hefty outrigger systems that allowed you to kind of span that dimension with that kind of height. The building that's there now is significantly narrower at the base. Yes, at the base it's a little bit narrower. That allowed us to put the parking drum on the north side there and the drop-off area. The initial building wasn't I say parallel on the north-south faces, but it actually was more of a parallelogram that had this other kind of offset leg on the north to give it a little extra stability. So it changed quite a bit. The other thing that changed was as it began to develop, we recognized that housing was going to be a major component in it. As an office building, you want as big a lease bands as you can get as a developer because you can lease that space. As a residential building, you can't use all that depth. One of the problems that Hancock has is if you've ever been in those units, they're fairly deep units. And the interior spaces get a long ways away from the window. Well, that's not a product that you can market very easily today, and Tom knew that. So he said, well, I gotta have narrow lease spans. I gotta get a lot of people next to the glass. So the development of the form wasn't just the big sort of tapering and setting back in the broad dimensions, but if you look at the narrow dimensions, the building also sort of sets back quite a bit. And again, that was in response to office space being able to be provided at the base, ultimately being converted into hotel space, which could use a little bit of extra depth, to residential space at the top, which is much narrower.
I know that every time I look down Wabash Street, I lament the fact that that building's not taller, because that's one of the few places in Chicago where you can see a super tall and get the full height. So much has been built around the Sears Tower and the John Hancock Center that you really don't see the full bulk of the building.
Right.
Do you think that that you nailed it correctly, the height of the building? Could it have gone a little taller, or are you satisfied that this is the right height for this building? We'd all love to see more building there.
Well, I tell you, I think the building height is right. It's not an in-your-face figural building. It's a very good contextual building. It fits very comfortably in the city. When I was talking earlier about the height of the building, and Donald approached us and said, well, how big should it be? We looked at the city and said, well, there were three big buildings. There's Hancock, there was Sears, and there was the Aon Center. Hancock and the Aon Center virtually identical in terms of height. One's 1127, and Aon I think is 1136, and then there's the Sears. And we said, again, nobody knew what buildings were going to be like. We didn't want to create another Target. At that time, building another world's tallest building would have been something that they felt might not give the right impression to the American people and public, that we should be somewhat subdued about it. So we chose 1,125. And when you look at the way those masses are distributed in the city, they feel very comfortable in the way that they're spaced apart. And so it really created a group of four buildings that had this very nice spacing, and that did a very nice thing on the Chicago skyline. And we looked at buildings that were taller, but it tended to, it was a little bit awkward in terms of the way they stair-stepped from Sears to Aon, back to a taller trunk, back down to the Hancock. So Sears still occupies, the figural corner piece. It's the 800-pound gorilla. And then the other three establish that very kind of nice datum, and they work very well with one another. I know what you mean about the height. When you look down Wabash, it's like part of you says, "Oh man, I wish I would have put another 300 feet on that." It's a very elegant shape. Some of Blair's criticisms, are about the width at the base. Even if it were taller, it wouldn't have helped that aspect of it significantly. But the views down Wabash and then looking north up Wabash, are some phenomenal views of that tower, and it looks very, very thin from those views.
Did the base of the building end up being better? Because we were over there the other night, and it's wonderful how you walk around the Riverwalk and around the base of the building, and it keeps going and going and going, and you've got these winding pathways through there and these big pots of chrysanthemums, and it's just it's a wonderful space. It's one of the nicest spaces in the city. Would you have gotten that with the original proposal? Probably not.
Probably not, but we had always, just like in Broadgate, we were very concerned about the public realm and giving something back to the city and doing the right thing, for cities. And we had always planned a park or an open space between the Wrigley Building and the tower. It was, it wasn't significantly smaller with the 2,000-foot tower, but I think even with the 2,000-foot tower, we would have had to do something. The Chicago Riverwalk is something that the mayor is supporting and the planners are very much. And there are guidelines with that with new development along the water. In fact, there's either 30 or 40-foot easement and a certain height that they require. Obviously, with this building and the narrowness of the site, it wasn't possible. That's what gave way to sort of the terracing of the project away from the river and pulling up the underbelly of those first levels so high off of the street level was to create that kind of public space which supported the initiatives of the Chicago Riverwalk system and allowed that sort of connection to happen. It's a wonderful space, as you say. It's one of the nicest in the city. It's landscaped beautifully, but more than that, the connection to the river is very important to the city. And it also established that very important connection between State Street, the northern part of State Street, and the southern part of Michigan Avenue. If you made that walk with the old Sun-Times building in the winter and you took your life in your own hands, right? I'm surprised they didn't have little ropes so you could hang on to so you didn't get blown into the river. We spent a lot of time in the wind tunnel trying to understand, the effects of wind and how this new pedestrian passageway could be better. Again, it's tucked underneath the tower to help that. Even in the winter time, it's going to be a wonderful way to connect between State Street and Michigan Avenue.
I'd like to wrap this up by asking you about the future of 2,000-footers. We've been hoping for them in Chicago now for the better part of 20 years. Some of those proposals have come out of your office. They've come and gone, and we've got one on hold now, and we still don't have one. And this period of time after 9/11, I guess we've kind of had a chance to rethink whether a building of that height is still relevant and doable. Are we going to see it, and what is the future of tall buildings in the United States?
It's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer to that. I wish I had a crystal ball. In Chicago specifically, the 2,000-foot proposal that we had out there, there's a lot of residential real estate that's available in the city. Building tall comes at a premium. As long as there's enough product out there that's high-end product, in both the residential and the commercial market, it's doubtful that we'll see tall buildings like that. I think if you look around the world at the tall buildings being built, they're not being built out of economic necessity, but they're being built more out of what I'll call ego. The United States, the buildings are very pragmatic. They tend to be driven by cost, thank God sometimes. As such, it's going to be very difficult to build a 2,000-foot building and make it work on paper. There's just too much available and too much out there that is available that you won't be able to support that unless you find someone who really wants to come in with an ego and say, I'm gonna buck the trends. I'm gonna go for it. It's possible, but I just don't see it happening in the very near future.
And even so, we should mention that the Trump Tower is the tallest building built in the United States in the last, since the Sears Tower,
Yes.
which has been 30-something years. Even at the height it's at, it's still a grand structure and a wonderful new addition to the skyline of Chicago.
It is.
Thank you for joining us, Timothy Poell with Skidmore, Owings & Merrill in Chicago at the 2009 CTBUH Tall Building Conference.